بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستجيره ونستنصره اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين وعلى صحبه المختارين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم يا رب العالمين، اللهم لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد أن هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة. ربنا وافتح بيننا وبين قومنا بالحق وأنت خير الفاتحين. ربنا وآتنا ما وعدتنا على رسلك ولا تخزنا يوم الدين. ربنا عليك توكلنا وإليك أنبنا وإليك المصير، فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا ربنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. سبحانك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Subhanallah, when Allah tells us in His revealed book that Muslims have a job, God gives us a charge, if you will, marching orders. And the task that Muslims are given is to bear witness, shuhada ala nas, that you will bear witness for God. And as we said many times before, and as the Quran underscores, when it interplays the role of bearing witness for God for the sake of justice, and then bearing witness for justice for the sake of God, the message cannot possibly be clearer that God and justice are interchangeable. In fact, it's clear from the text of the Quran, from this revelation, and from the living example of the Prophet ﷺ himself, that the charge to be with God for the sake of justice and to be with justice for the sake of God are one and the same. But to pause for a second, and as we said in Surah Al-Hajj, when Allah underscores that the role, the function, the charging orders, the obligation, the duty that Muslims carry is to bear witness, shuhada ala nas, and then for the Prophet ﷺ to bear witness on Muslims. Shahadatul Rasul, the bearing witness that the Prophet ﷺ performs about his ummah, about those who accepted the delegation by being Muslims. After his death, will primarily manifest in the hereafter. The traditions are numerous about the role that the Prophet ﷺ will play in the hereafter. The role of witnessing and assessing and evaluating and at times interceding on behalf of his ummah. But to pause for a second and to think of how serious this charge is. And it's remarkable because it is students of history that can best understand how critical that charge of bearing witness for God on humanity, how critical and important it is. One, the equating between God and justice. At the time it was done, in the context that it was done, in other words, when the Quran expressed that. If only we knew how remarkable and unprecedented and indeed revolutionary that was in the realms and in the annals of religious thought in the Near Eastern context. It is truly revolutionary. But second, consider the context. Those who are aware of the history of monotheism would know the extent to which the Near Eastern region, and indeed the world at large, struggled with polytheism, truly struggled with the idea of a single abstract God that can be accessible to human beings without intermediaries. Judaism struggled with it for centuries, and it required a number of theological reformations for Judaism to reclaim any form of monotheism. And any idea of monotheism as laying the groundwork for equality and anything approximating the idea of justice. Christianity, up till the Protestant Reformation, wrestled with both the idea of monotheism, which arguably it never succeeded in achieving through the concept of Trinity, and of course, through the long history of Catholicism, the idea that God can only be accessed through an intermediary, and that the sanctity of the church is more important than any substantive idea such as equality or justice, is something that Christianity struggled with for centuries. And indeed, in my humble opinion, neither Judaism nor Christianity would have ever achieved anything close to the idea of monotheism, of Tawheed, and of Tawheed translating to substantive qualities such as justice and equality, had it not been for the Islamic intervention in the world of religious thought. And if Muslims were not a colonized people, they would have started to understand the significance of the role that they played as Muslims in the liberation of human beings far beyond the context of Islam. So I go back to this notion of Shahada. When the Quran tells Muslims that your role is to be shuhada an-nas, to bear witness on humanity, at the time Islam is but a phenomenon in the middle of the Arabian desert. If you can approach the matter anthropologically and sociologically, you would have thought, that sounds crazy. How are these desert people, these people who are on the margins of civilizations, Near Eastern civilizations, in this area called Hijaz, in the middle of the desert, are in any way to assume that role? But subhanAllah, I want to introduce what I think is a very important theological idea. We all know that power corrupts. And we all know that when power bears witness, when the strong bear witness, invariably the strong are corrupted by their own power. Power brings hubris. Power brings bias. Power is anchored in privilege. And power is a serious obstacle to any fair role of bearing testimony or bearing witness. Now, Muslims, shortly after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, and shortly after the period of the companions, are born into power. They create an empire, an imperial order that, sure, brought many advancements to human beings, not the least of which are the advancements that will eventually result in the birth of someone like Maimonides and in Judaism, and will eventually result in the birth of someone like Martin Luther and Thomas Aquinas in Christianity. So in fact, yes, the empire shines light beyond its borders. But we cannot ignore the fact that the privilege of power exercised a corrupting influence on the ability of Muslims to bear witness for centuries. The irony is that Muslims are best positioned to carry the burden of bearing witness when they are indeed at their weakest, when they have joined the ranks of the persecuted, the dispossessed, the disinherited. The irony is that we Muslims today are better positioned to understand the Quranic command to bear witness on humanity than in any other time in Islamic history. I've always wondered why the concept of bearing witness on humanity received very little development in Islamic history. And the answer is clear. Because for so many centuries, Muslims were anchored in power. And being anchored in power, the incentive to bear witness, because no one can see justice like those who suffered the lack of it. No one can see what injustice is like those who suffer injustice. You can't read the Quran as if it's an advisory manual. You can't read the Quran as if it is a form of literature, or as if it is some exercise in acoustics. You cannot turn the Quran into a source of just entertainment or comfort. It is God's commands. These are God's orders. And when God tells us, you Muslims must bear witness, we can't ever accept that, well, the predecessors, the ancestors have thought about it and they figured it out. And if you liberate yourself from these falsehoods, you do indeed realize that bearing witness to see justice and to see injustice and to perform that function requires a great deal of development of consciousness and awareness. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه. So, I want you to imagine the following. In the United States, a university has an incident report. The incident report is that the university found graffiti sprayed somewhere on campus. And let's go a step further. And let's say that this graffiti is racist, anti-Semitic. Although I'm not sure what the graffiti actually said. In response, the university, in conjunction with the county, in conjunction with the FBI, and an FBI task force on terrorism, storms the house of two female students, the parents, the house of the parents of these two female students. And for 6 hours, searches the house, incidentally refuses to show the family a warrant before they conduct the search. They seize computers and electronics. They terrorize the family, interrogate the students. No one is arrested. But the university takes a restraining order against the students, barring them from coming to campus for 4 years. This actually happened in the United States, in George Mason University. And it happened to a Palestinian family whose daughters were active in the Justice for Palestine organization. George Mason suspends the organization, it's the Justice for Palestine organization, bars the students from campus for 4 years. As I said, an anti-terrorism task force, the FBI anti-terrorism task force, with the county, Fairfax County, with the university police, storm the students' house, seize their electronics, treat them like garbage, like criminals. And the excuse that is given is that we are investigating a graffiti incident. This happens in a wider context. In fact, there is a new book that has just been published called Suppressing Dissent, in which some 30 scholars come together to review incidents of suppression of freedom of speech all around the Western world, including the United States. Add to this, remember the incident at George Mason University, And there was, by the way, another incident in Philadelphia in which, again, the house of activists for Palestine, students in Philadelphia at Temple University, was stormed and searched and computers seized, etc. So George Mason, what happened to George Mason is not an isolated incident. At the same time that we see a bill introduced in Congress, Jason Smith, representative from Missouri, introduces the bill, an unprecedented bill. 80 nonprofit organizations joined a statement in which they pleaded with the Means Committee at the House, Ways and Means Committee, to quash that legislation. But the House passed the legislation anyway, and the legislation, in an unprecedented way, empowers the Secretary of Treasury. The Secretary of the Treasury to designate any nonprofit organization in the United States as a supporter of terrorism. And in doing so, deny it the privileges of nonprofit status, leave alone the label of being accused of a supporter of terrorism. And there are numerous problems with that bill that passed the House, least of which is that there is really no way to challenge that designation, and that it doesn't distinguish between domestic and international terrorism. And it pretty much, as the father of the bill, the person who introduced the bill, Jason Smith, said that he is introducing this bill in the House because, according to him, he sees anti-Semitic conduct happening all over the United States, and he wants to target organizations responsible for this anti-Semitism. Translation, those who are speaking loudly about the genocide in Palestine. What does all of this have to do with Shahada, with bearing witness? Keep in mind that at the same time that this bill passed the House, Amnesty International, after the International Criminal Court indicted Netanyahu, Amnesty International just came out with a report calling a spade and saying that Israel is responsible for a genocide. The report is extremely detailed and, in fact, considers all of Israel's arguments and evaluates all the excuses that Israel and claims that Israel uses to justify perpetuating this genocide. Critically, the report says that it is not just Israel that is responsible for the genocide, but the countries that continue to supply arms to Israel for this genocide, the United States and Germany and Britain, that they are directly in violation of the Genocide Convention. Well, think about it. We are placed, whether we like it or not, we Muslims are put in the position confronting very dangerous orientations and tendencies that are facing humanity at large. There is a threat to the environment that we Muslims can bear witness to. But no less significantly, if not even more importantly, there is a very real threat to the very values that have defined human civilization in our day and age. At no time in modern history has the Genocide Convention come under a real threat like now. The meaning of the Genocide Convention, the prohibition, you shall not commit genocide. Democracy itself is under an unprecedented threat since the age of modern democracies. The very concept of freedom of speech and freedom of thought is being betrayed by those who invented the idea of freedom of speech and freedom of thought in the modern age. Muslims have a choice. They can continue to ignore the Quranic command and bear witness only to myopic, ghetto-like issues of concern only to Muslim culture, like making a big to-do about the chador or the hijab, or a big to-do about quote-unquote Islamic issues. Or they can wake up to the marching orders that Allah gave them. You shall bear witness for the sake of justice, for God. You shall bear witness for the sake of God, for justice. You shall bear witness at humanity. And then Muslims would realize that the testimony of Amnesty International is their testimony of direct interest and concern to the very function that they are supposed to play in the modern world. That instead of trying to always deny the fact that they are disempowered and disinherited and dispossessed, to embrace the role of the disempowered and disinherited, and to raise their voice in justice, and to unite with all others who also bear witness against injustice. And then our age, our historical period, becomes meaningful in ways that were never realized in Islamic history before. Allahumma afu anna, Allahumma aghfir lana, Allahumma arhamna ya Rabbal Alameen, wa tub alayna, Allahumma ansur al-Islam wa a'izz al-Muslimin, warfa bifadlik kalimat al-haqq wa ad-din. Allah forgive our sins, strengthen our faith, enable us the insight and the understanding and the strength to rise and fulfill our obligations as Muslims, especially in this critical age where justice needs its supporters and friends everywhere. At the forefront of those justice calls out for are your people, the people of Islam. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم وأقم الصلاة.